Margaret Caldwell drove the heel of her boot through the courthouse door of Philadelphia's 3rd District the morning after they buried her father. And the sound it made when the wood split from the frame brought 3 clerks scrambling into the hall. She was holding a forged will in her left hand and a sworn affidavit in her right, and her brother Preston stood behind the clerk's counter with the expression of a man who had expected tears and received something considerably worse. "You will record this contest," she said, "or I will burn every fraudulent document in that filing cabinet before the ink dries on your denial." They called the constable. They removed her from the building, and Preston Beaumont, her father's son by blood and his betrayer by choice, had her boarding house room emptied and her name struck from the family accounts before she reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. That was 14 months ago. If this story is already hitting close to home, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Margaret all the way to the end. I promise you, she is just getting started. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far her story travels. The stagecoach hit the frozen rut at the edge of Silver Creek's main street hard enough to throw Margaret Caldwell sideways into the door, and she caught herself with one hand flat against the ice-cracked window and held herself steady by sheer will, while the other passengers grabbed at the overhead straps and swore. She had not let herself fall in 14 months. She was not going to start in Dakota Territory. When the wheels found flat ground again and the coach lurched to a groaning stop, Margaret straightened her coat, picked up her father's leather satchel from the floor where it had slid, and pressed it against her side with the particular grip of a woman carrying something irreplaceable. Through the frost-edged window, she could see the main street of Silver Creek assembling itself into view. A hardware store, a dry goods, a boarding house with a sagging front porch, and on the corner, standing apart from everything else with fresh white paint on its sign and new glass in its windows, the First Territorial Bank of Silver Creek. A sheriff's office sat 12 feet to its left. Margaret looked at the distance between those 2 buildings and felt the familiar cold clarity that used to come over her in her father's office when she read a contract that had been written to deceive. 12 feet. Close enough that a man could step from one door to the other without changing his stride. She filed it away. The driver opened the coach door, and she stepped down before he could offer his hand, her boots cracking through the thin crust of frozen mud on the street. The cold hit her face like a slap. Not the wet, penetrating cold of Philadelphia winters, but something drier and more absolute. A cold that meant business and did not apologize for it. The town looked at her. She had expected this. She had been looked at her entire life. First as a judge's daughter, then as a woman who spent too much time in courtrooms, then as a woman who had the audacity to contest a will in public and lose loudly. She had learned to receive a stare the way her father received a hostile witness, without flinching, without performing, just letting the stare run out of momentum on its own. A man outside the feed store said to his companion, loud enough that silence wasn't the intention, "That's the woman Voss sent for. Lord Almighty, she's going to last 2 weeks." His companion said, 2 weeks is generous." Margaret set her traveling bag beside the coach wheel. She looked at the feed store man with the same pleasant, unreadable expression she had used in 14 months of losing fights against her brother's bought lawyers. The expression that said she had heard every word and was storing it somewhere useful. The man looked at his boots. "Mrs. Caldwell." She turned. Elijah Voss was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, hat in hand, and the first thing she registered was that he was not what she had imagined. And the second thing she registered was that the way he was looking at her was not disappointment exactly. It was the careful, measuring look of a man who has been surprised before and has decided to be thorough before he decides how he feels about it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built the way men get built when their work requires it, and not a pound of it is for decoration. His beard was thick and black, his eyes a dark, still brown beneath the brim of a weathered beige hat. He wore a dark leather vest with several pockets, the habit of a man who used to carry things that needed to be reached quickly, over a heavy canvas shirt. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, thin and old, the kind that comes from something precise rather than something careless. He was holding his hat in both hands and turning it once, slowly, and then he stopped turning it. "I'm Eli," he said. "Margaret," she said. "My trunk is the one with the brass clasp. I'd appreciate it before the driver decides it's easier to leave it in Bismarck." He looked at her for one more moment, that careful, measuring look, and then he moved to the coach without a word. She let out a slow breath. Behind her, she heard the sharp-faced woman from the dry goods store say to someone, "None of them last. He'll be hauling her trunk back down this mountain by February." Margaret picked up her traveling bag. She did not look back. The wagon Eli drove was a flatbed working rig, scarred and solid, hitched to two draft horses whose coats were thick with winter. There was a buffalo robe on the bench and a Winchester in the cradle beneath it. Margaret climbed to the bench before he came back from loading her trunk, arranged the robe across her lap, and tucked her father's satchel between her feet, where she could feel it against her ankles. Eli swung up, took the reins, and looked at her once more with that assessing quiet. "You climb fast," he said. "I've been climbing fast for 14 months, she said. "I got good at it." He turned the horses. The wagon began to move. They were 3 minutes out of town, the last storefront dropping behind the tree line, before she said, "The letter mentioned 2 children." "Nora's 9, he said. "Thomas is 6. "Do they know I'm coming?" "They know." "Eli." She kept her eyes on the trail. "Do they want me to come?" He was quiet long enough that the silence had weight. The horses found their rhythm on the rising grade, hooves crunching against frozen ground. The wind moved through the pines above them with a low, continuous sound, like something breathing. "Nora hasn't said," he said finally. "Thomas wants to know if you can make biscuits." "I can make biscuits." "Then you've got one of them handled." She almost smiled. "What about you?" He looked at her sideways from under the hat brim. "What about me?" "Do you want me here?" It was a direct question, and she knew it landed that way because she felt the slight change in him beside her. Not recoil, just recalibration. The adjustment of a man who had expected something more careful and had received something honest instead. "I need somebody here," he said. "Whether I want it—" He paused. "That's a harder question than I've had time to work out." "Fair enough," Margaret said. "I'll ask you again in a month." He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed. Almost nothing, just a fraction of released tension along the back of his neck. And she noted it the way she noted everything. Quietly, without announcement. In the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. The trail climbed steadily through stands of ponderosa pine, the cold deepening as the elevation rose. Margaret pulled the buffalo robe higher across her lap. She was thinking about the bank. She was thinking about the 12 feet between the bank and the sheriff's office, and about the name the marriage broker's letter had mentioned. Cornelius Hatch, First Territorial. And about the way the broker had written that name, carefully neutral, the way people write the names of things they are afraid of, in case the paper is read by the wrong person. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been asking me things since you stepped off the coach," Eli said. "Doesn't seem like you need permission." "The broker's letter mentioned the bank," she said. "It mentioned there had been some pressure regarding the property. I'd like to know what that means before I walk into your house and meet your children." The silence this time was different, longer, heavier. "Cornelius Hatch," he said. His voice didn't change much, but something underneath it did. A tightening, like a rope pulled to its working limit. "He runs First Territorial. He's been after the mineral rights to my lower acreage for 2 years. He knows, or believes, there's silver under the west pasture." He paused. "When Eleanor died, I took 2 loans to cover her doctoring costs. Hatch has called them both in on terms that aren't legal under territorial banking law. But the county judge is—" He stopped. "In his pocket," Margaret said. Eli looked at her. "I grew up in a courthouse," she said quietly. "I know what that sentence sounds like when it's left unfinished." He looked back at the trail. "He gave me until the 1st of February. Sign the mineral rights over, or he forecloses on the whole property." "Do you have the loan documents?" "Yes." "The repayment records?" "Yes." "Has he filed anything with the territorial court yet?" "Not that I've seen." He glanced at her again, something shifting in his expression. Not warmth yet, but something adjacent to it, something cautious and half-formed. "Why?" "Because a man who files creates a record," Margaret said. "And a man who avoids filing is a man who knows his position won't survive scrutiny." She looked out through the pines at the pale winter sky. "Which means he's buying time, same as you. And that means there's still room to move." Eli was quiet for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is," Margaret said. "That's generally been useful." The ranch came into view when the trail broke through the last stand of timber and opened into a wide clearing on the south face of the ridge. The house was 2-story timber, dark with age and weather, solid in the way of things built to last rather than to impress. The barn was larger than the house. 3 corrals, a smoke shed, a frozen kitchen garden along the east wall, its rows still visible as faint ridges under a skim of snow. On the porch, 2 children stood waiting. The girl was straight-backed and still, her arms at her sides, watching the wagon approach with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that new things arriving usually means something else departing. Fair hair, dark dress, her father's jaw, her father's careful eyes. She looked older than 9 in the way that children look older than they are when they have been carrying something heavy. The boy was gripping the porch railing with both fists and straining toward the wagon at the full reach of his arms, his entire small body pitched forward with an urgency that the railing was the only thing containing. "Pa!" he hollered before the wagon stopped. "Is that the lady? Is she here?" "Thomas Voss, get back from that railing," Eli called, with the practiced exhaustion of a man who has said these words more times than he can count. Thomas retreated approximately 4 inches. Margaret stepped down from the wagon. She walked to the porch steps and looked up at them, Nora measuring her with those still, careful eyes, Thomas barely containing himself. And she did not smile the way adults smile at children when they want something from them. She looked at them the way she looked at anyone she intended to deal with honestly. "You're Nora," she said. "You're smaller than I thought," Nora said. "People say that." "Are Philadelphia women usually bigger?" "We vary," Margaret said, "like women everywhere." She shifted her gaze to Thomas. "And you're Thomas." "Yes, ma'am." He said it with his whole chest. "Can you make biscuits?" "Pa can't make biscuits. He makes cornbread, and it's always too hard." "I heard that," Eli said from behind Margaret. "It's true, Pa." "I can make biscuits," Margaret said. "I can also make cornbread that isn't hard, if you give me access to the kitchen." Thomas turned to Nora with the triumphant expression of a 6-year-old who has just won an argument he didn't know he was having. Nora was not looking at her brother. She was looking at Margaret with those steady, grave eyes, and what was behind them was not hostility, but something more complicated. A grief so practiced it had become structure, the way scar tissue becomes structure, holding the shape of what used to be soft. Margaret climbed the porch steps. She stopped in front of Nora, close enough to speak at a register that didn't carry. "I'm not here to make you pretend anything is fine," she said. "I know it isn't fine. I'm not going to walk into your house and act like I belong there before I've earned it. But I am here, and I intend to stay. And I'd rather we understood each other from the start than spend the winter pretending." Nora looked at her. "You don't have to like me yet," Margaret said. "You don't have to like me at all, if it comes to that. But I'd ask you to be straight with me, because I'll be straight with you." Nora was quiet for a long, measuring moment. Then, "The kitchen flue pulls wrong on the left side. Smoke comes back at you if you open the damper too fast." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I'll remember that. Pa says he'll fix it." "Nora," Eli said, from the top of the porch steps, her trunk on his shoulder. "It's been 4 months, Pa." "I'll fix it this week." "You said that last week." Eli met Margaret's eyes over the top of his daughter's head, with an expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old and has made a kind of peace with this being his life. Margaret kept her face neutral, but only just. Nora pushed through the front door. Margaret followed. The inside of the house told her everything the exterior had already begun to suggest. The floors were swept, the windows clean, the cook stove well maintained. These were the marks of a man who could not let everything go, who had held the essential things together by force of will when everything else was sliding. But the curtain rods above the windows were empty. The table had 3 chairs. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall beside the pantry door. A woman with yellow hair and 2 smaller figures beside her. And no one had taken it down. Margaret looked at the drawing for 1 second. Then she looked away and did not look back. Her room was off the main hall, a small space, private, with a rope bed and a washstand and a window that faced the frozen kitchen garden. Nora stood in the doorway. "It was my mother's sewing room," she said. "Pa moved the table out." "When?" "Last week." Margaret set her traveling bag on the bed. "Thank you for telling me." "I'm not telling you to make you feel something," Nora said. Her voice was careful with its own precision, the way children's voices get when they are saying something that matters and they are afraid of being understood wrong. "I'm telling you because you should know what this room is." "You're right," Margaret said. "I should." She turned to face her. "Nora, I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you're someone who can handle honesty better than most adults I've met." She paused. "I came here because I ran out of other options. Your father brought me here because he ran out of other options. That's not a romantic story, but I found that people who find each other at the end of their options sometimes build something steadier than people who had choices. Does that make sense?" Nora considered this with the same serious attention she seemed to bring to everything. "What options did you run out of?" "That's a longer story." "I have time." "Not tonight, you don't," Eli said from the hallway, setting Margaret's trunk down with a thud that echoed through the floorboards. "Go check on Thomas. He's been too quiet for the last 5 minutes, which means he's done something." Nora went, with the resigned competence of a child who knows she is the one who manages these things. Eli stood in the doorway of the small room that had been his wife's sewing room, his hand on the frame, looking at Margaret with that careful, dark-eyed assessment that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but caution. The specific caution of a man who had trusted the world and had the education of finding out what that cost. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything yet," she said. "I should have told you about the bank before you came." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She held his gaze. "But you'll tell me now? All of it? Tonight?" after the children are settled." She moved to the washstand, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and began washing the road off her hands. "And Eli, when you tell me, don't soften it. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." He was quiet behind her. She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. "You keep saying we," he said. "We are married," she said. "We signed a contract." "That's what a marriage is, where I come from." She dried her hands on the small towel beside the basin and turned around. "A contract between two people who intend to honor their obligations. I intend to honor mine." She looked at him steadily. "Do you?" The question landed the way she meant it to. Not as a challenge, but as the thing it actually was. An honest request for an honest answer from a woman who had had enough of half-truths to last her a lifetime. Eli Voss looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light through the small window was fading fast, the sky outside going the deep gray blue of winter dusk. Somewhere in the back of the house, Thomas laughed at something. A sudden bright sound in the quiet, and then Nora's voice came, flat and managing, and Thomas laughed again. "I honor my obligations," Eli said. "Good," Margaret said. "Then we'll be all right." He nodded once, the short, deliberate nod of a man who does not make promises easily and means the ones he makes. He turned to go. "Eli," he stopped. "The flu," she said. "I'll look at it now, before I start supper. Don't let it trouble you." Something moved across his face, too fast and too complicated to name, but she caught the edge of it, the way you catch the edge of something passing in your peripheral vision, and know it was there even after it's gone. He walked down the hallway without another word. Margaret picked up her father's satchel from the bed. She held it for a moment, its worn leather familiar under her palms, its weight precisely what it had always been. She had carried it from Philadelphia to Bismarck to Silver Creek with her own hands, never checked, never set down, because what her father had hidden in its false liming before he died was not something she could afford to lose, and not something she could yet afford to use. She tucked it carefully beneath the rope bed, behind the bedboard, in the shadow where it would not be immediately visible. Then she went to the kitchen, stood to the right of the stove as Nora had told her, opened the damper slowly, and listened to the flue draw clean and even on both sides. She found the coupling pin loose in its housing, exactly where she expected it. She seated it back into position with the spine of a narrow knife from the drawer beside the stove, tapping it carefully until the mechanism moved without resistance. She built the fire. She set water to boil. She began assembling what she would need for supper, moving through the pantry with the efficient, cataloging attention of a woman learning the logic of a new space. She was cutting salt pork when she heard Eli's boots in the hallway, and then the sound of him stopping in the kitchen doorway, and then a silence that had a particular quality to it. She looked up. He was looking at the stove, at the clean, even draw of the fire, at her. "You fixed the flue," he said. "Loose coupling pin. I've been meaning to get to that since October." "Now you don't have to." She set down the knife. "Eli, tonight, after supper, I need you to bring me every piece of paper in this house with Cornelius Hatch's name on it. Every bank notice, every loan document, every letter. And I need you to tell me the name of every person who has ever delivered anything to this property from that bank." He came the rest of the way into the kitchen. He pulled out the nearest chair, one of 3, and sat down heavily, with the specific weight of a man setting down something he has been carrying too long. "You really did grow up in a courthouse," he said. "My father was a property attorney for 30 years, she said. "I ran his office for 7 of them. I can read a land contract the way you read a trail." She came to the table and sat down across from him. Not directly across, but at the angle you sit when you're working on the same side of a problem. Cornelius Hatch built whatever he has built on the assumption that you are either going to break under pressure or come at him with a rifle. He has not built it to withstand someone who knows how to read what he's actually done. She held his gaze. The territorial banking statutes have specific language on secured agricultural loans, specific limits on interest accumulation. If his loan terms exceed those limits, and based on what you've described, I believe they do, then the debt he's using as leverage is built on a fraudulent foundation. Eli stared at her. Not the careful, measuring stare of before. Something rawer than that. "You're telling me it might not be legal," he said. "I'm telling you, I need to see the documents before I tell you anything for certain," she said. "But yes, that is what I'm telling you." She paused. "Will you bring them to me?" He looked at the table, at his hands, flat on the wood, at the 3 chairs around the table instead of 4, at the drawing on the wall that she had looked at once and not looked at again. "Margaret," he said. "Yes?" "Why are you doing this?" It was not an aggressive question. It was the question of a man who had been alone long enough that the motivations of other people had become genuinely difficult to trust, and who was asking honestly because he needed to know. "Because this is my home now," she said. "Because those are my children out there making noise in your back hallway. And because the kind of man who builds a ranch like this, who raises children like yours on his own for 2 years without letting them fall apart," she paused, "that's not a man who deserves to lose it to a corrupt banker and a bought judge." He looked at her for a long time. Thomas's voice carried from the back of the house, loud and urgent. Nora's came back, short and capable, managing him with the unconscious efficiency of a child who has been someone's anchor since before she was old enough to understand the weight of it. Eli stood. He walked to the heavy cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. Iron clasp, solid construction, the precision of a man who organized his important things like a Pinkerton agent, because that was what he had been. And he opened it. He brought the papers to the table and set them in front of her. "First loan notice is on top," he said. "March of this year." Margaret opened the document. She read quickly, with the practiced efficiency of 7 years in a working law office, her eyes moving down the columns of figures and clauses. She reached the 3rd paragraph and stopped. She read it again. She reached into her father's satchel, the outer pocket, not the lining, and withdrew a slim volume. Her father's annotated copy of Montana and Dakota Territorial Property Statutes, 1879 edition, its margins dense with his careful hand. She turned to the section on secured agricultural lending. She laid it open beside the bank notice. "Read this clause," she said, pointing. "Then read this one." She moved her finger to the corresponding clause in Hatch's document. Eli leaned forward and read. His jaw tightened slowly, the way a vice tightens, steadily, with intention. "He's charging me nearly double the legal limit," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "For 2 years." "Yes, which means the total debt he's calling in is inflated by a fraudulent interest calculation," Margaret said. "Which means it cannot be legally enforced. Which means the foreclosure threat is built on a number that should not exist." She kept her voice even, because this was the moment in her father's office when you kept your voice even. When the thing you had been working toward finally showed itself, and you did not let the relief of it make you careless. It also means that Cornelius Hatch and whatever clerk processed and signed these documents have been knowingly applying illegal terms GK contract. That is fraud. That is a federal matter, not a county matter, which means Deacon Morse's jurisdiction is not relevant. Eli sat back in his chair. He looked at the document. He looked at the statute book. He looked at her. Outside the window, the last light left the sky, and the ridge went black against the stars. The fire held its ground, GK. From the back of the house came the sound of Thomas laughing again. And this time even Nora laughed, a short, bright sound that seemed to surprise itself. Eli Voss heard his daughter laugh, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things change when they have been frozen for a very long time, and something warm finds a way through. Just at the edges, just enough to see. He looked at Margaret. "I have spent 2 years," he said slowly, "believing the only way through this was a rifle or surrender." "There's a third way," she said. "There's always been a third way. He just needed you to not know it existed." She closed the statute book carefully. "He made one mistake, Eli. He assumed you'd come alone." The fire crackled. The wind moved across the ridge outside with its long, cold breath. Eli Voss reached across the table and turned the lamp up higher so they could both see the documents clearly. "Show me," he said. And Margaret Caldwell, Margaret Voss, opened the first bank notice to the beginning and started to build their case. They worked until the lamp oil ran low. Margaret had spread Eli's documents across the kitchen table in the order she needed them. Loan origination papers on the left, payment records in the center, Hatch's notices arranged by date on the right. And she moved between them with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had done this kind of work in a real office with real consequences and knew exactly what she was looking for. Eli sat across from her and answered her questions. She had a lot of questions. He was not a man who enjoyed being questioned, and she could feel that in the particular economy of his answers, short, precise, giving her exactly what she asked for, and no more. But he answered every one, and he did not deflect, and she respected that more than she would have respected eloquence. "This payment," she said, tapping a receipt dated the previous April. "You made this in Bismarck?" "Wrote up in the 3rd week of April. Paid the installment at the territorial office on 5th Street. Clerk named Aldous Webb processed it." "And you have the receipt?" "You're holding it." "I'm asking if this is the only copy." He paused. "Webb gave me the carbon. I've got it in the back of that stack." Margaret found the carbon copy, laid it beside the original receipt, and examined both. "These match exactly," she said, "which means there is a record of this payment in the territorial office's own files, independent of anything Hatch controls at the county level." She set them both aside, face up. "He can't touch these. Even if he's bought Deacon Morse, the territorial office in Bismarck is outside the county judge's jurisdiction." Eli was quiet for a moment. "You're building a wall around the evidence before you go after the fraud. My father always said there's no point winning an argument if the other side can burn the evidence after you make it." She looked up. "He was right about most things." "What did he get wrong?" She looked back at the documents. "He trusted that the system would work if you followed the rules correctly." She paused. "My brother proved that wrong for him. Unfortunately, my father didn't live long enough to see it." The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire and the wind outside moving through the pines on the ridge. Eli refilled both their coffee cups without being asked. Black, no ceremony, and set hers where she could reach it without looking up from the papers. It was such a small thing. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, and filed it in the same place she was filing everything about Eli Voss. Not making conclusions yet, just collecting. "Hatch sent a man up here last week," Eli said. She looked up. "I didn't put it in the papers because it wasn't on paper." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Man named Crail, rides for Hatch, does his enforcement work. He came up the South Trail on a Wednesday morning, said he was delivering a courtesy notice. but he spent 20 minutes looking at the barn and the corrals and the west pasture before he gave me the envelope. He paused. Men who are delivering paper don't need to look at your land that long. He was assessing the property, Margaret said, calculating its value against what Hatch expects to gain from the mineral rights. She picked up the February deadline notice and read it again. Eli, has Hatch ever put the mineral rights in writing? Has he ever explicitly stated in a document that silver is the reason he wants the lower acreage? No. His letters just say he's asserting a prior claim on the water access through the lower pasture. Water access, she said, and the way she said it made him look at her sharply. That's what he calls it. He's not filing on the mineral rights, because filing on mineral rights creates a federal record and invites federal scrutiny, she said. He's trying to acquire the land itself through the foreclosure, and once he owns it, the mineral rights transfer automatically. The water access claim is a legal fig leaf. She set the notice down. It also means he doesn't have a valid mineral survey on file. If he did, he'd have used it. Which means his entire position depends on nobody examining his actual legal standing too closely. She looked at Eli across the table. He picked you specifically because he believed you wouldn't know how to look. Eli held her gaze. He was right, until about 2 hours ago. He was right until you got married, she said. There's a difference. Something shifted in his expression, that complicated, careful thing she kept catching at the edges of him. And then it settled back into its usual stillness, but not entirely the same stillness as before. Something had moved in it, slightly, permanently. It's late, he said. She looked at the window. The darkness outside was total, the thick black of a winter night far from any city, and she had no idea what time it was. I want to draft a letter to the Territorial Banking Commission in Bismarck tonight, she said. Before I sleep. Just a preliminary inquiry. No names yet, no accusations. Just a request for clarification on the legal interest limits for secured agricultural loans in Dakota Territory in 1880 and 1881. A request like that from a private citizen creates a record of inquiry without showing our hand. You think they'll answer? They'll have to. It's a formal inquiry under the territorial statute. They're required to respond within 30 days. She began organizing the documents into 2 separate stacks, the one she needed to keep accessible and the one she needed to protect. By the time they respond, I want to have a complete accounting of every illegal dollar Hatch has charged you, with the legal citation for each violation, ready to file the moment we have the Commission's clarifying letter as supporting authority. Eli watched her hands moving across the papers. Where did you learn to do this? I told you, my father's office. Your father taught you to build a legal case? My father taught me to read contracts and statute books, she said. I taught myself the rest. Because I spent 7 years sitting in on depositions and court hearings and watching my father work. And I paid attention. She tied the second stack of documents together with a cord from her traveling bag. And then my brother stole everything, and I spent 14 months trying to fight it. And I learned what doesn't work just as thoroughly as I learned what does. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what didn't work? Assuming the system wants to be fair, she said. It doesn't. It wants to be stable. Those are not the same thing. If you want fairness, you have to make it more stable for the system to rule in your favor than to rule against you. She looked up. That's what the Territorial Banking Commission letter does. It makes it more stable for them to acknowledge the legal limits, because they're already on record as the authority on those limits, than to ignore an inquiry that's now in their official files. Eli looked at her with the expression of a man who was revising something he had decided prematurely. When the broker sent me your letter, he said slowly, you wrote that you had administrative experience. I did? I thought that meant you could manage a household ledger. I can manage a household ledger, she said. I can also dismantle a fraudulent foreclosure. I thought it better not to oversell. For the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Silver Creek, Elijah Voss almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. It was more the ghost of a smile, the territory where a smile would be in a man who had more practice letting them through. But it was there, and it was real. And she filed it in the same careful place she was filing everything else. She was still writing the draft letter when the back hallway floorboards creaked, and Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, his hair crushed flat on one side from the pillow, his eyes blinking in the lamplight. "I can't sleep," he announced. "That's because you should be sleeping," Eli said, without turning around. "Go back to bed." "I had a bad dream." "What about?" Thomas considered. "Bears." "There aren't any bears in the house, Thomas." "I know, but what if there were?" Margaret set down her pen. She looked at Thomas, this 6-year-old boy standing in a kitchen doorway in the middle of a Dakota winter night, his face entirely serious about the hypothetical bear problem, his feet bare on the cold floorboards, and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something she didn't have a legal term for. "Come here," she said. Thomas looked at his father. Eli gave a short nod. Thomas came to the table and stood beside Margaret's chair, looking at the papers spread across the surface with wide, interested eyes. "What's all this?" he said. "Important papers," she said. "Is it about the bank man?" Margaret went very still. She looked at Eli, who had gone similarly still across the table. "What do you know about the bank man?" Eli said, his voice carefully level. Thomas shrugged one small shoulder. "Nora said the bank man wants to take our house. She said that's why you got a new wife." He looked at Margaret with complete, guileless directness. "Are you going to stop him?" Margaret held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." Thomas absorbed this. Then he nodded, with the satisfied gravity of a 6-year-old who has received a straight answer to a straight question and found it sufficient. "Okay," he said. "Can I have a biscuit?" "It's the middle of the night," Eli said. "I'm hungry." "You're not hungry. You're avoiding sleep." "I'm both," Thomas said, with a precision that was entirely his father's. Margaret stood up. She went to the pantry and found the cold cornbread from supper, and cut a small piece and brought it back. She handed it to Thomas, who took it with both hands and the expression of a child who has won something important. "Now go back to bed," she said, "and stay under the blankets. Your feet are like ice." "How do you know?" "Because I can see them from here, and they're the color of ice." Thomas looked at his own feet. He looked back at her. Then he turned and padded back down the hallway, already eating, his footsteps receding until a door closed softly at the far end. The kitchen settled back into its nighttime quiet. "He doesn't do that," Eli said. Margaret sat back down. "Eat cornbread in the middle of the night?" "Come out to talk to people." He was looking at the hallway where Thomas had disappeared. "Since Eleanor, he's been careful around strangers. Stays back. Watches." He paused. "He walked right up to you." Margaret picked up her pen. "He wanted to know about the bear. He wanted to see if you'd send him away." She looked at Eli. He was looking at the table, his jaw set, his hands flat on the wood on either side of his coffee cup. She had come to recognize that posture. It was the posture of a man saying something that cost him something, said flatly and without ornamentation, because ornamentation would make it harder to say. They've been watching people leave for 2 years, he said. Doctor came up 3 times while Eleanor was sick. Left each time. The broker sent 2 women before you. Both left inside the week. Thomas was 4 when Eleanor died. Old enough to know when someone's gone. Young enough that gone is just gone. No explanation that holds. He paused. He tests people. Walks up and asks something that doesn't matter, like the bear thing, and sees what they do. "What did I do?" she said quietly. You answered him like he was worth answering. He finally looked up. And you gave him the cornbread without making him feel like a problem. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the draft letter in front of her. "He is worth answering," she said. "They both are." She paused, her pen above the paper. "Eli, for what it's worth, I'm not going to leave." "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't. I'm saying it because it's true." She began writing again. "I came here with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, which means I have a great deal of freedom in the choosing of what to do next. I'm choosing this." Her pen moved across the page. "I'd appreciate it if you'd extend me the same assumption of permanence you'd extend anyone else in this house." He was quiet for long enough that she had written 2 full sentences before he said, "All right." "All right," she said. She finished the letter. She read it back twice, made one small correction, and folded it into the envelope she had brought from her traveling bag. She wrote the address of the Territorial Banking Commission on the front in her father's precise, clear hand that she had spent years learning to imitate because clients trusted it. "I need this sent from town tomorrow," she said. "Not by anyone connected to the ranch." "Is there someone in Silver Creek who isn't in Hatch's circle?" Eli thought. "Ruth Calloway runs the laundry on the east end of town. She and Hatch have a history. He tried to buy her building 2 years ago, and she wouldn't sell. She's not in his pocket. Can she post a letter without it being remarked upon? She posts letters every week for half the people in the valley who can't get to town. Nobody pays attention to her mailbag." "Good." Margaret held the envelope out across the table. He took it, and for a moment both their hands were on it, and she felt the warmth of his fingers, calloused and certain, before he drew it back. "I'll go down in the morning," he said. "Take the children," she said. "It should look like an ordinary supply run. Don't go to the bank, don't go near Hatch's building. Post the letter with Ruth Calloway and come home." He tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his vest, over his chest, where it would stay dry and flat. "And you?" "I'll be here," she said. "I have more reading to do." She gathered the documents into their organized stacks and tied them carefully. "And I want to look at what's in the root cellar before the real cold comes. If Hatch does try to escalate before we're ready, I want to know exactly what this household can sustain through a long winter without needing to go to town." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind shifted direction and hit the north wall of the house with a sound like a hand pressing flat against a door. "What are you expecting him to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But a man who has been operating without opposition for 2 years, who suddenly finds his deadline approaching and his target not responding the way targets are supposed to respond, that man does something. He either escalates the legal pressure or he finds a way to make the situation personal." She paused. "We need to be ready for both." Eli stood up slowly, the way a man stands up when his body is tired, but his mind is not going to let him rest easily anyway. He pushed his chair back. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the back of the chair, looking at the organized stacks of documents she had built from the chaos he had been carrying around in a cabinet for months. "You put them in order," he said. "Chronological within each category," she said. "Loan origination and terms on the left, payment history in the center, Hatch's communications on the right." The ones with the illegal clauses have a slip of paper marking the relevant passage. He looked at the stacks. He looked at her. My wife, Eleanor, she was organized like that. Not with legal documents, with the house, with the children's schedules, with the planting calendar. He said it carefully, the way you say something you haven't said out loud in a long time, and aren't entirely sure you should be saying now. She kept everything running so that I could keep everything safe. We had a system. Margaret waited. I forgot what it felt like, he said. Having a system. We'll build a new one, she said. Different. Ours. He looked at her for a moment longer, and what was in his face was still complicated, and still cautious, and still carrying the weight of 2 years of grief and isolation. But underneath all of that, very quiet and very careful, something else had begun to find its footing. She didn't name it. It was too soon to name it. But she saw it, and she let it be. Good night, Margaret, he said. Good night, Eli. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. She listened to his footsteps on the treads, heavy, even, unhurried, and then the quiet of the house settling around her. She turned back to the documents. She was reaching for the next paper in the stack when her hand touched, instead, the edge of her father's leather satchel, still sitting beside the table where she'd left it. She had not opened the concealed lining. She had told herself she was not ready, and she had told herself she could not afford to wait much longer, and both of those things were still true. She picked up the satchel. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, and then she found the small brass tack along the interior seam that her father had shown her once, 2 weeks before he died, pressing her fingers to it and saying, quietly, in the voice he used when he was being very serious, "Not yet, Margaret. Not until you're somewhere safe. Not until you need it." She pressed the tack. The false bottom released with a faint, precise click. Inside, folded flat against the leather, were documents. 6 pages, her father's handwriting on the first page. And on the second page, a signature she recognized. Not her father's signature, and not her brother's, but a third name that made the blood go out of her face entirely. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she read all 6 pages, slowly and completely, twice. When she finished, she sat back in the chair and looked at the fire. She understood now why her father had hidden them. She understood now why Preston had been so desperate to get the satchel back. And she understood now, with a cold and absolute clarity, that what she had walked into in Silver Creek, Dakota Territory, was not a coincidence, and Cornelius Hatch's name on Eli's loan documents was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle of one that had started in Philadelphia, in her father's office, 3 years before his death. She folded the 6 pages back into the false lining. She pressed the tack. The bottom sealed. She set the satchel flat on the table in front of her, both hands resting on the worn leather. And she thought about Preston, who had hired men to follow her. She thought about the distance between Philadelphia and Silver Creek, and about whether that distance had felt to her brother like safety or like a problem requiring a solution. She thought about Eli's children asleep in the back room, and about the letter she had just sent toward Bismarck, and about how much she did not yet know and how much she could not afford to get wrong. Then she reached for the lamp, turned it down, and sat in the near dark of the kitchen with her hands on her father's satchel and her eyes on the fire, watching it hold. She did not sleep until the fire burned down to coals. When she finally lay down on the rope bed in Eleanor Voss's sewing room, still dressed, the satchel pressed against the wall behind her head, where she could feel its edge against her palm, her mind would not stop moving. It ran the 6 pages her father had hidden in the false lining, the way a tongue runs a sore tooth. Not because running it helped, but because it could not stop. The third page was the one that mattered most. It was a letter, written on the letterhead of a Philadelphia investment firm called Calhoun and Meridian Partners, dated March of 1879, signed by a man named Gerald Calhoun, and countersigned by her father as a witness to the transaction. The transaction itself was a private lending agreement, a significant sum extended to a Dakota Territory land acquisition venture, collateralized against projected mineral extraction revenue from properties the venture expected to acquire in Silver Creek County over the following 3 years. The name of the Dakota Territory Venture's operating agent was Cornelius Hatch. Her father had witnessed that document. He had sat across a desk from Gerald Calhoun in Philadelphia and pressed his notary seal to a contract that sent private Eastern capital into Hatch's operation in Silver Creek. And then, at some point after that, at some point her father had never explained to her because he had run out of time, he had become afraid enough of what he knew to cut a false bottom into a leather satchel and tell his daughter to keep it close and not open it until she was somewhere safe. She did not yet know what her father had found. The 6 pages told her the shape of the thing, but not its center. What she knew was this: Calhoun and Meridian Partners had funded Hatch. Her brother Preston had been an associate attorney at Calhoun and Meridian for 4 years before their father's death. And the forged will that Preston had used to steal the family estate had been drafted and filed so quickly after their father died, within 11 days, that it could not have been prepared after the death. It had been prepared before. Her father had known it was coming. He had known, and he had not been able to stop it, and the best he could do was hide what he knew in the bottom of the satchel and put it in his daughter's hands. She stared at the dark ceiling of the sewing room and thought about what her father had been trying to tell her. Then she thought about Silver Creek, about a bank with fresh paint on its sign and a sheriff's office 12 feet away, about Eli Voss's illegal loan terms and Hatch's 2-year campaign to acquire the West Pasture, about the fact that she had answered a marriage broker's advertisement in a Philadelphia boarding house and followed it to Dakota Territory, and the man waiting for her at the end of that trail was being systematically destroyed by money that her own brother had helped arrange. It was possible it was coincidence. She had spent 14 months in courtrooms, and she knew what coincidence looked like in legal documents. And it did not look like this. She was still working through it when she heard the boards in the hallway creak, and then Nora's voice, low and urgent, and then Eli's, and then boots moving fast toward the back of the house. Margaret was off the bed before the second set of footsteps passed her door. She came into the hallway to find Eli moving toward Thomas's room with a lamp. Nora 2 steps behind him, her face pale in the lamplight. "What is it?" Margaret said. "Thomas," Nora said. "He's burning up." The fever had come on fast, the way fevers do in small children. No warning, no gradual climb, just a sudden, devastating heat that turned Thomas's face the color of coals and made his small body shake under the blankets with a violence that was frightening to see. He was conscious, but barely, his eyes glassy and tracking slow, his breath coming in short, labored pulls. Eli had his hand on Thomas's forehead, and his face had gone the particular stillness of a man controlling terror through force of will alone. Margaret had seen that expression on her father's face once, during a case that had gone badly wrong, and she knew what it cost to hold it. "How long has he been like this?" she said. "Nora heard him about an hour ago," Eli said, his voice flat and controlled. "She came to get me. He was already this bad." "Did he complain of anything before bed? Sore throat? Earache? Chills?" "He said his head hurt at supper," Nora said quietly. "I thought it was because he was tired." "It probably was, at supper," Margaret said. She sat on the edge of Thomas's bed and put the back of her hand to his cheek, his neck, the inside of his wrist. Hot, all of it, uniformly hot, no cold patches. This isn't his chest. His breathing is labored from the fever, not from congestion. That's something. She looked at Eli. I need cold water, as cold as you can get from the well, and the extra blankets from the cedar chest, not to warm him up. I need to wet them and use them to bring the fever down from the outside. Eli was already moving before she finished the sentence. Nora, Margaret said. The girl was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, her face doing the careful, controlled thing that her father's face did when it was managing something that wanted very badly to become panic. I need you to talk to him. Don't let him go to sleep yet. Talk to him about anything. The biscuits, the horses, what he wants to do when the snow melts. Can you do that? Yes, Nora said, and the steadiness in her voice was real, not performed. She crossed the room and sat at the head of Thomas's bed and took his hand. And Margaret heard her begin to talk in the low, matter-of-fact tone of a child who has sat beside a sick person before and knows that what they need is the sound of a voice they trust. Eli came back with the water. They worked together without discussion, without needing to negotiate who did what. Eli following Margaret's direction, and Margaret moving with the focused, quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what needs to happen next. She had nursed her father through 2 bad winters. She had sat with him through the illness that ultimately killed him. And she had learned in that long, exhausting year what a fever looked like when it was dangerous, and what it looked like when it could be managed. And this one, terrible as it was, could be managed. The next 2 hours were the longest of the night. Thomas drifted in and out of coherence, calling for his mother once in a voice so small and certain that it went through Margaret like a blade. Eli, who was wringing cold cloths beside her, went entirely still for the length of one breath. Then he kept ringing. She used to sing to him, Nora said, quietly, from the head of the bed. When he was sick. The same song every time. What song? Margaret said. Nora told her. It was a simple thing, an old folk song Margaret's own mother had sung, and the coincidence of it, if coincidence is what it was enough to make her throat tighten briefly before she got control of it. She began to hum it, low and without performance, while she worked. Thomas's breathing began to slow towards something more even within a few minutes. By the time the sky outside the window had begun to go from black to the deep gray blue that comes before dawn, the fever had broken. Not gone, still present, still needing watching, but broken enough that Thomas slept a real sleep, his breath coming quiet and steady, his color shifting back from alarming to merely pale. Eli sat back in the chair he had pulled to the bedside somewhere in the middle of the night and put his face in his hands. Margaret did not look away. She let him have the moment, which was not weakness, and both of them knew it. After a minute, he took his hands down. His eyes were red at the rims. He looked at Thomas, sleeping, and then at Margaret. Thank you, he said. It came out rougher than he probably intended, the way things come out when a man is too exhausted to manage their edges. He's going to be all right, she said. Keep the cold cloths going through the morning. If the fever climbs again before noon, we send to town for the doctor. If it keeps dropping, he's through the worst of it. Eli nodded. Eli, she waited until he looked at her. This is not what happened to Eleanor. This is a winter fever in a child who was out in the cold yesterday afternoon with wet boots. It is serious and it needs watching, but it is not the same thing. He held her gaze for a long moment. How did you know that's what I was thinking? Because it's what I would be thinking, she said. Nora was asleep in the chair at the head of the bed, her head tilted against the wall, one hand still loosely holding Thomas's. Eli looked at her, at his daughter, who had come to get him in the middle of the night and sat for 2 hours talking her brother back from the edge of sleep, and was now exhausted and trusting that the adults in the room would hold the rest of the watch. "She's been carrying too much," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Margaret said. "She has. I didn't know how to stop it. After Eleanor, she just stepped into it, started managing things. I let her because I didn't have anything left to manage it with myself." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not something a father should say." "It's an honest thing," Margaret said. "And it was 2 years ago and you were drowning. What matters now is that you know it and you want it to be different." "I don't know how to give it back to her," he said. He stopped, searching for the word. "The being 9. She's forgotten how." "She hasn't forgotten," Margaret said. "She just needs to see that someone else is holding the weight for a while." She glanced at Nora. "She already trusts you to hold Thomas's weight tonight. That's not nothing." Eli was quiet. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the lamp on the bedside table, its light steady and small in the dark room. "The letter," he said. "I'll take it to Ruth in the morning." "Take Nora with you," Margaret said. "Let her pick something from the dry goods. Something she wants, not something practical. Don't make it a task. Just let her choose." He looked at her. "That simple?" "It's a start," she said. "Simple starts are where everything begins." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but in the vicinity of one. The low exhaust of a man releasing something held too tight. "You talk like a woman who's worked things out."
"I talk like a woman who made a lot of mistakes getting to where she is," she said. "There's a difference."
He looked at her for a moment longer. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take the watch."
"Wake me in 2 hours," she said. "If the fever shifts at all, wake me immediately."
"I will." She stood, and her body informed her loudly that it had been awake for approximately 22 hours and had spent a significant portion of them bent over a child's bed. She straightened carefully. She picked up the lamp from the bedside table and carried it toward the door. "Margaret." She turned. Eli was looking at her from his chair beside Thomas's bed, his big hands resting on his knees, the exhaustion on his face making him look younger than he did in daylight. Or maybe not younger, just less armored. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know this isn't what most women would want. The situation, the children, all of it." He paused.
"I just want you to know that I see what you did tonight, and I don't take it for granted."
She stood in the doorway with the lamp and looked at Elijah Voss, sitting in the dark beside his sleeping son. And she thought about the 6 pages in her father's satchel, and about everything she did not yet know, and about what she did know, which was that this man and these children were in danger from a direction they didn't understand, and that she was the only person who currently had the pieces to understand it. She was going to have to tell him about the documents. Not yet, not tonight, not when he was exhausted and already at his limit, but soon. Because what was in that satchel changed the shape of the fight they were in, and he had a right to know what shape it actually was. "Get some rest when you can," she said. "We have work tomorrow." She carried the lamp back to the sewing room. She set it on the washstand. She sat on the edge of the rope bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and thought carefully about the order in which things needed to happen. The letter to the Territorial Banking Commission had to go first. That was already done. The accounting of Hatch's illegal interest charges needed to be completed and ready to file. And then she needed to understand the connection between Calhoun and Meridian Partners in Philadelphia, her brother Preston, and the money behind Hatch's operation in Silver Creek. Because if that connection was what she believed it was, then the fight was not just about a ranch in Dakota Territory. It was about whether the people who had destroyed her father's life and stolen his estate had GK extended their operation westward, and whether Eli's land was a coincidence or a target specifically chosen because of GK beneath it, and who could GK to facilitate its taking. She needed more information. She needed it from a source inside Silver Creek who was not connected to Hatch. She thought about what Eli had said. Ruth Calloway runs the laundry on the east end of town. She and Hatch have a history. He tried to buy her building 2 years ago, and she wouldn't sell. She posts letters every week for half the valley. A woman who ran a laundry in a frontier town knew things. She handled the linens of the bank, the sheriff's office, the boarding house. She saw who came and went, and when, and with whom. She had survived 2 years of Hatch's pressure without selling, which meant she was not easily intimidated and not lacking in spine. Margaret needed to meet Ruth Calloway in person, not send a message through Eli, not ask questions through an intermediary. Meet her, sit across from her, and find out what she knew and what she had seen, and whether what she had seen matched what Margaret suspected. She lay back on the rope bed and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she would send Eli and Nora to town with a letter and instructions to come back by noon. She would stay with Thomas, and she would spend the morning finishing the accounting of Hatch's fraudulent charges and drafting the second document she needed. Not a letter to the banking commission this time, but a detailed affidavit of everything she had observed and cataloged since arriving in Silver Creek, signed and dated in her own hand, filed in the outer pocket of her father's satchel beside his annotated statute book. Her father had taught her one thing above all others. He had said it to her when she was 19 years old, and she had asked him how he won the cases that seemed unwinnable. He had set down his pen and looked at her over the top of his reading glasses and said, without any drama, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "Margaret, you build the record before you need it. Because the moment you need it is always the moment you don't have time to build it." She had not understood it fully then. She understood it now. She was still thinking when she heard, from down the hall, Eli's voice, low and even, talking to Thomas, who had apparently woken briefly. She couldn't make out the words, just the voice, patient and steady in the dark. A father keeping watch over his child through the last hours of a long night. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge in a long, cold sweep, and then settled, and the house was quiet. She did not intend to sleep, but she did, briefly, deeply, the sleep of a person who has finally allowed themselves to acknowledge that they are somewhere they intend to remain. When she woke, the window had gone from black to the pale silver gray of early morning, and from the kitchen she could smell coffee, and she could hear, faint but unmistakable through the walls of the small room, the sound of Thomas's voice, thin and a little hoarse, but coherent, asking his father a question. She could not hear Eli's answer, but she heard Thomas laugh, small and tired and real. She sat up. She pulled on her boots. She reached under the bed and touched the edge of her father's satchel. A habit already, a check, a reassurance that it was still there. It was. She stood up and went to start the day. She had just built the kitchen fire back to a working heat and set the coffee pot to reheat when she heard boots on the porch. Not Eli's measured tread, but something quicker, heavier, 2 sets of feet, and then a knock on the front door that was not a neighborly knock. It was the kind of knock that does not apologize for the hour. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the Winchester in its bracket beside the door, and she looked at the door, and she made a decision in the space of 2 seconds. She opened the door without the rifle. The man on the porch was broad and dark-coated, with the kind of face that had been arranged by years of outdoor work and deliberate expressionlessness into something that gave nothing away. Behind him stood a second man, younger, holding both their horses. The first man looked at her with a flat, assessing attention that she recognized from her father's office. Not a rancher, not a local. A man who was paid to go places and observe things and report back. "Mrs. Voss?" he said.
"Yes,"
she said. "My name is Crail," he said. "I ride for Mr. Cornelius Hatch, of First Territorial Bank. I'm here with a courtesy message for your husband."
"My husband is occupied," she said.
"You can give the message to me." Crail looked at her for a moment, with the particular calculation of a man deciding how much the person in front of him understands about what is actually happening. "Mr. Hatch wanted me to extend his personal regards to the new Mrs. Voss," he said. And the way he said "personal regards" made it clear that regard was not the operative word. "He also wanted me to let you know that he is aware you've been asking questions in town about First Territorial's lending practices." She had been in Silver Creek for less than 48 hours. She had spoken to exactly no one about First Territorial's lending practices except Eli, alone in their kitchen, with the doors closed. Which meant either the walls of the Voss Ranch had ears, or Cornelius Hatch had received a report from someone who had been watching the house. She kept her face entirely still. "I have no idea what Mr. Hatch is referring to," she said pleasantly. "But please, do extend my regards to him in return, and let him know that my husband's affairs are in good order." Crail looked at her for one more moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat. Not courtesy, just the motion of it, and turned back to his horse. Margaret stood in the open door and watched them ride out of the clearing and into the pines, and she did not close the door until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded entirely. Then she turned around. Eli was standing at the end of the hallway, Thomas's blanket over one shoulder, his hand resting on the wall beside him. He had heard all of it. "He knows," Eli said. "He knew before we started," Margaret said. "The question is, how?" She looked at him steadily. "Eli, is there anyone who has regular access to this property? Someone who comes and goes that you might not think twice about?" He was quiet for a moment. His jaw tightened in the slow, deliberate way she was learning to read as the visible surface of something working underneath. "The supply boy from the feed store comes up twice a month," he said carefully. "Young kid, 14, maybe 15. Hatch's brother-in-law owns the feed store." The fire crackled in the kitchen behind her. She thought about the letter sealed in Eli's vest pocket, addressed to the Territorial Banking Commission in Bismarck, not yet sent. "Go to Ruth Calloway today," she said, "but don't take the main road." Eli took the east trail down the ridge, the one that cut through the timberline and came out behind the livery stable on the far end of Silver Creek's main street. A route that added 40 minutes to the journey and kept him off the main road, where Crail or anyone riding for Hatch would expect to see him. He took Nora, as Margaret had asked. He left before the morning had fully established itself, the sky still pale and undecided. Thomas sleeping in the back room with his fever down to something manageable, and Margaret sitting in the kitchen chair she had pulled to his doorway, her father's statute book open on her lap. She was not reading the statute book. She was thinking. Crail's visit had changed the shape of what she understood. Not the facts were the same, but the urgency beneath them. Hatch had someone watching the property. He had known within hours that she had been going through the loan documents, which meant the timeline she had been building in her head, careful, methodical, a month to assemble the full legal case before they moved, was not a timeline she could count on. Hatch was not waiting for the 1st of February because he was patient. He was waiting because he believed he had already won and was simply allowing the paperwork to catch up to the outcome he had arranged. She needed to move faster. Thomas woke mid-morning, hungry and substantially more himself. The fever reduced to a low, persistent warmth that was uncomfortable rather than dangerous. He ate the broth she made him without complaint, which told her he was genuinely improving, because in her experience, small boys only ate broth without complaint when the alternative was feeling worse. "Mrs. Voss," he said from his pillow, turning the cup in his small hands. "Thomas, are you going to be here when I wake up tomorrow?" She looked at him. His face was entirely serious, the way his face got when he was asking something that mattered. The direct, guileless sincerity of a child who has not yet learned to hide the things he needs. "Yes," she said. "And the day after?" "And the day after that," she said. "For a very long time, Thomas. That's the plan." He considered this. Then he handed her back the empty cup and closed his eyes. And within 2 minutes, he was asleep again, with the sudden totality of a sick child who has received the information he needed and can now rest. She sat with the empty cup in her hand for a moment. Then she set it on the washstand, went back to the kitchen table, and opened the accounting ledger she had been building since the previous night. By the time she heard the wagon on the trail at noon, she had completed the full accounting. Every loan payment Eli had made, correctly dated and sourced against his own receipts. Every interest charge Hatch had applied, cross-referenced against the territorial banking statute's legal limits for each corresponding period. The difference between what Hatch had charged and what he was legally permitted to charge, calculated to the dollar, documented line by line with the relevant statutory citation beside each entry. The total fraudulent overcharge across 2 years of loan service came to $212. $212 in illegal interest charges, carefully documented, was not just a defense against foreclosure. It was, under the territorial fraud statutes her father had annotated in the margin of page 47 of his statute book, grounds for a criminal complaint against the lending institution and its officers. She heard the wagon stop. She heard Nora's voice, brighter than it had been yesterday, and then Eli's, and then the door. Eli came in first. He had the look of a man who had gone to town expecting one thing and returned carrying another, his expression doing its characteristic complicated work beneath its surface calm. Nora came in behind him with a small package wrapped in brown paper tucked under her arm, something from the dry goods, something she had chosen herself. And her face had a quality Margaret had not seen in it yet. Not happiness exactly, more like the temporary lifting of something heavy. The face of a child who had been, for a few hours, just a child. "Ruth Calloway," Eli said, setting his hat on the peg, "wants to meet you." "When?" "She said whenever you can come to town. She said don't send a message, just come." He looked at Margaret steadily. "She also said to tell you she was sorry about your father." Margaret went still. She knew my father? She knew of him. She said Hatch mentioned his name once, 2 years ago, when he was pressuring her to sell the laundry building. She said Hatch told her that a Philadelphia attorney named Caldwell had certified the investment agreements behind his operation, and that the money behind him was Eastern money, and it didn't lose. Eli paused. "She said she looked up your name when she got the letter this morning, because the name Caldwell was familiar to her. She put it together." Margaret set down her pen. "She also said," Eli continued, his voice careful now, watching her face, "that 2 months ago, a man came through Silver Creek asking questions. Not a local. Well-dressed, Eastern clothes. He was asking whether anyone had seen a woman traveling alone from Philadelphia. Mid-30s, dark red hair." He paused. "He was asking at the boarding house and the stage depot." The kitchen was very quiet. "My brother," Margaret said. "Or someone he sent." "Either way, my brother." She looked at the accounting ledger on the table, at the 6 pages in her father's satchel under the bed in the next room, at Eli, standing by the door with his hat in his hand, watching her with those dark, still eyes that had been watching her and cataloging her and slowly, carefully deciding since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. Eli, I need to tell you something. I should have told you last night, but the timing. I'm telling you now. He came to the table and sat down. He did not ask her to hurry. He simply sat and waited, with the particular patience of a man who has learned that some information requires the person delivering it to find their own way to the beginning. She told him all of it. The 6 pages in the false lining of the satchel. Gerald Calhoun and the investment agreement. Calhoun and Meridian Partners. And her brother Preston's 4 years as an associate attorney there. The money that had come east to fund Hatch's Silver Creek operation. Her father's decision to hide what he knew instead of act on it. And the 11 days between his death and the filing of Preston's forged will, and what that timing meant. She told him clearly and completely, without softening or dramatizing, in the same flat, precise voice she had used in her father's office when presenting a case summary. Because that was what this was. A case. And he was her client and her partner, and he had a right to every fact she possessed. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your brother funded Hatch?" he said finally.
His firm did, and I believe, I don't have documentary proof yet, but I believe that my father discovered something about the nature of that funding that frightened him enough to hide evidence and warn me without being able to tell me directly what I was being warned about.
She looked at him.
I think the mineral survey on the West Pasture is not Hatch's private intelligence. I think it came from Calhoun and Meridian's investment research. I think they knew about the silver before they funded Hatch, and the entire operation was designed from the beginning to acquire specific properties.
Including mine.
Including yours.
He sat with that for a moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. So this was never just about a bank loan.
No, she said. It was never just about a bank loan.
She paused.
Which means the foreclosure attempt is not Hatch acting alone.
It's the end stage of an investment strategy that was designed in a Philadelphia office 3 years ago. And if Preston sent someone to Silver Creek 2 months ago looking for me, he knows, or suspects, that I have the documents that can prove it. Eli looked at the satchel, where it sat on the table between them. Then he looked at her. "How much danger are you in?" "Less than I would be if I were alone," she said. "More than I'd like." He held her gaze. "And the children?" "Hatch wants the land," she said. "His interest is economic. As long as we're between him and the legal completion of the foreclosure, we're obstacles. He'll use pressure and legal maneuvering before he escalates beyond that. Because violence creates complications he doesn't need when he believes he already has the law on his side." She paused. "My brother is a different calculation. He's not an economic actor. He's a frightened man who knows what I'm carrying." "Then we move before he does," Eli said. "Yes. We need Ruth Calloway. If she has information about Hatch's operations, about who has been coming and going from First Territorial, about the connections between Hatch and Deacon Morse, it changes what we can file and where we can file it." She picked up the accounting ledger. "I also need to send a second letter, not to the Territorial Banking Commission, to the Federal Circuit Court in Bismarck." Eli looked at her. "The fraud I've documented in this ledger is not just a territorial banking violation," she said. "If the funding behind Hatch's operation crossed state lines, and it did, from Philadelphia to Dakota Territory, then it falls under federal jurisdiction.
federal court is outside Deacon Morse's reach. It's outside the county sheriff's reach. She set the ledger down. But to file with the federal court, I need more than the accounting. I need the connection between Hatch and Calhoun and Meridian, documented in a way that I can put before a federal judge. The 6 pages in my father's satchel establish the connection. But my father is dead, and I am his daughter, which makes me an interested party. I need a corroborating witness. Ruth Calloway heard Hatch name your father. If she'll swear to it in an affidavit, yes. Margaret pressed her hands flat on the table. Which is why I need to meet her. Tomorrow. I'll go to town myself. I'll take you. I need you to stay with Thomas. Nora can watch Thomas for a few hours. Nora is 9 years old, and Thomas has a fever. Then I'll take you, and we'll bring them both, he said, with a finality that was not stubbornness, but something more considered than that. The decision of a man who has evaluated the options and arrived at a position he intends to hold. I'm not sending you into Silver Creek alone, Margaret. Crail came to this house this morning. Hatch knows you're asking questions. If something happens in town, and I'm up here on the ridge... He stopped. I'm not doing that. She looked at him. He looked back, steady and entirely unmovable. All right, she said. We all go. Something in him released, not obviously, not with any performance, just the subtle shift of a man who has been braced and has found that the ground held. Good, he said. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had taken off her coat and was holding her brown paper package against her chest. Thomas is awake, she said. He wants to know if there are biscuits. There will be, Margaret said. Give me 20 minutes. Nora turned to go, then stopped. She looked at Margaret with those grave, measuring eyes. You're going to fix it, she said. It was not entirely a question. Yes, Margaret said. How do you know? Because I know what they did wrong, Margaret said. And when you know what someone did wrong, and you have the documents to prove it, they've already lost. They just don't know it yet. Nora absorbed this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she nodded, a single sharp nod that was so precisely her father's gesture that Margaret had to look back at her ledger for a moment to keep her expression even. Nora went back down the hall. Eli watched his daughter go. Then he looked at Margaret with an expression that was past complicated now, past cautious, moving into something she didn't have a legal term for and didn't try to name. She hasn't done that in 2 years, he said. Done what? Decided to trust someone. Margaret began measuring flour for the biscuits. She did not answer immediately, because the thing she wanted to say required a moment to say correctly. She found the lard tin in the pantry, the salt, the baking powder. She assembled them on the counter with the focused, quiet efficiency that Eli had been watching her bring to everything since she arrived. She's decided to trust the situation, Margaret said finally. Not me specifically. The situation. The fact that someone is fighting this. Children trust momentum. They trust the feeling that something is being done. She worked the lard into the flour with her fingers, the way her mother had taught her. The trust in me comes later, if I earn it. He watched her work. You're not what I expected, he said. It was the same thing he had said on the trail from town, 2 days and a lifetime ago. You said that already. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I mean it differently now. She looked up from the bowl. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded on the surface in front of him, not performing anything, not managing anything, just looking at her with a direct, uncomplicated honesty of a man who has stopped rationing his words because the person across from him has demonstrated she can handle what he's actually carrying. My wife, he said carefully.
Eleanor. She was the kind of woman who made a hard life feel soft. She had that gift. She could smooth things over, make the edges of things less sharp. The children loved her the way you love something warm, easily, naturally. He paused. You're not like that. Margaret waited. You make the edges of things clearer, he said. Sharper. You walk into a room and the problems in it stop being vague and start being specific. That's... He stopped. I don't know if it's a gift or something you paid for. Both, she said. The same answer she had given him on the trail. Usually the things that are genuinely useful are both. He looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not the ghost of a smile this time, but something more decided. Something that had made it all the way through whatever gate he kept between what he felt and what he showed. I'm glad you came, he said. It was quiet and unornamented and entirely real. She held his gaze for a moment. So am I, she said. She turned back to the biscuits. He picked up the accounting ledger from the table and began reading it from the beginning, slowly and carefully, without being asked. They worked in the same kitchen, in the same warm quiet, for the rest of the afternoon. It was Nora who saw the rider first. She came to the kitchen door with her face carefully composed and her voice deliberately even. The performance of a child trying to report a frightening thing without sounding frightened. Pa, she said, there's a man at the south tree line. He's been there for about 10 minutes. He's not moving. Eli was on his feet before she finished. He took the Winchester from the bracket beside the door. He looked at Margaret. Take the children to the back room, he said. Bar the door from inside. Who would be watching from the tree line, she said. Not Crail, he said. Crail comes to the door. This is someone who doesn't want to be seen. He checked the rifle's load with the practiced speed of a man who has done it 10,000 times. Someone who was told to watch and report back, or someone waiting for me to leave. The cold that went through her was not from the draft under the door. Preston's man, she said. Or Hatch's. Either way, they know the layout of the property now. He looked at Nora. Go to Thomas. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me or Mrs. Voss. He looked at Nora hard. Anyone, Nora. You understand? Yes, Pa, Nora said, and went without another word, her footsteps quick and certain down the hall. Margaret moved to the cabinet beside the stove. She had located the spare revolver 2 days ago, when she was cataloging the household against a long winter, and she had noted its position without comment. She took it out now, checked the cylinder, and looked at Eli. He looked at the gun in her hands. He looked at her face. He did not tell her to put it down. The front of the house, she said. If he's at the south tree line, he can see the back door, but not the front porch from that angle. If you go out the front and circle north through the yard... He loses visual on me for about 40 seconds, Eli said. 40 seconds is enough. He looked at her for one moment, that measuring, careful look, but faster now, compressed to its essential core, the look of a man making a rapid and final decision about whether the person in front of him can be relied upon. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, he said, you take the children and the satchel, and you go north on the logging trail. It comes out at the Hennessy property 2 miles up. Abel Hennessy is a friend. You tell him what's happening. You'll be back in 15 minutes, she said. Margaret, you'll be back, she said steadily. But yes, I understand. Go. He went out the front door, pulling it shut behind him without a sound. She stood in the kitchen with the revolver in her hand and listened to the silence of the house. Thomas's breathing from the back room, faint and steady. The fire, the wind outside. And she counted. She had reached 43 when she heard voices outside. Not a shot, not a struggle. Voices, Eli's, low and controlled, and another voice she did not recognize, younger, and then a long pause, and then Eli's voice again, and then silence. The front door opened. Eli came in. Behind him, held by the collar of his coat, was a boy. 15, maybe 16, thin and frightened, wearing the clothes of someone who had been in the cold for several hours and was now paying for it in the particular shaking that comes from cold and fear arriving at the same time. Margaret recognized the description before Eli said it. The feed store boy. Hatch's brother-in-law's delivery boy. The one Eli had identified as the likely source of information about the property.
The boy looked at Margaret with wide, miserable eyes. "I didn't want to," he said, before anyone asked him anything. "Mr. Hatch said he'd tell my pa about the money I borrowed from the register. He said he'd have me jailed." His voice cracked on the last word, with the specific anguish of a child who has been leveraged into doing something wrong and has been carrying the weight of it alone. "I just had to watch and say if anyone came or went. That's all he said it was." Margaret set the revolver on the counter. She looked at the boy, at his shaking hands, his frightened face, the particular shame of someone who has been used and knows it. And she thought about what her father would do in this moment, in his office, with a frightened young witness who had been coerced. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly. "I'll get you something hot." Eli released the boy's collar. The boy sat. "What's your name?" Margaret said, setting the coffee pot back over the heat. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Price." "Daniel," she turned to face him. "How long have you been reporting to Hatch?" 3 weeks, he said miserably. "Since the day Mr. Voss went to Bismarck for the supply run. Mr. Hatch stopped me on the road and said he'd heard I'd been at the ranch, and he wanted to know who came and went." He looked at his hands. "I told him about the wagon the day Mr. Voss went to Bismarck. And I told him when the new Mrs. Voss arrived. And I told him—" He stopped. "What else did you tell him?" Margaret said. "That there was a lamp burning in the kitchen real late the first 2 nights. And that Mr. Voss took the east trail to town yesterday instead of the main road." He swallowed. "I was watching from the ridge. I could see the trail." Eli's jaw tightened. Margaret held up one hand, a small gesture, and Eli absorbed it and held still. "Daniel," she said, "I'm not going to have you jailed, and I'm not going to tell your father about the money you borrowed unless you want me to, which I suspect you don't." She sat down across from him at the table. "But I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it because it's right, not because I'm asking." The boy looked at her. "I need you to tell me everything Hatch said to you," she said. "Every word, every instruction, every conversation you had with him about this property. And then I need you to be willing to put it in writing and sign it." The boy went pale. "He'll know it was me." "He'll know it was you whether you sign or not," she said. "The question is whether your name appears on the winning side of this or the losing side." She held his gaze. "Cornelius Hatch is going to lose, Daniel. I want you to understand that before you decide. He has broken federal banking law. He has used a minor to conduct illegal surveillance. And there is now a record of inquiry in the Territorial Banking Commission's files in Bismarck that he cannot touch and cannot make disappear." She paused. "The only question is whether you are a witness for what's right or a loose end for a man who has already proven he's willing to use people and discard them." Daniel Price sat at the kitchen table of the Voss Ranch in the last light of a Dakota winter afternoon and looked at his hands for a long moment. He was 15 years old and frightened, and had been carrying something too heavy for his age alone. And what Margaret was offering him was not just protection. It was a way out that didn't require him to keep carrying it. He looked up. "I'll sign," he said.
Margaret reached for a clean sheet of paper and her pen. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the south ridge, and somewhere in its sound was the particular quality of a thing shifting, a balance tipping, an advantage changing hands, slow and irrevocable as water finding its level. Inside, the fire held its ground, and Margaret Voss began to write down everything the boy told her, building the record that would bring Cornelius Hatch's careful, corrupt architecture to the ground. Daniel Price's signed statement ran to 4 pages. Margaret wrote every word he gave her in her clearest hand, the hand she had learned from 7 years of transcribing her father's depositions. And when she finished, she read it back to him line by line and asked him to correct anything that was not exactly right. He made 2 small corrections. Then he signed his name at the bottom with the careful, deliberate signature of a boy who understood that what he was putting his name to mattered. And Margaret signed as witness, and Eli signed below her. She folded the 4 pages and placed them in the outer pocket of her father's satchel, beside the accounting ledger and her father's annotated statute book, and she closed the clasp. "You should go home tonight," she told Daniel. "Don't go near Hatch or the bank. If he contacts you, you tell him nothing has changed and you saw nothing unusual. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "If he pressures you beyond what you can manage, you come here, directly here. Don't stop in town." She looked at him steadily. "You did the right thing tonight, Daniel. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing." He left on his horse into the last gray light of the afternoon, and Margaret stood on the porch watching him go until the pines took him, and then she went back inside. Eli was at the table, reading Daniel's statement from the beginning. He read it with the focused, line-by-line attention of a former detective, which was what he was. And when he finished, he set it flat on the table and looked at Margaret. "This is enough to file," he said. "Almost," she said. "Tomorrow I need Ruth Calloway." He nodded once. "We go at first light." They left before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Thomas was well enough to ride, bundled in the buffalo robe on the wagon bench between Margaret and Eli. His color nearly back, his voice restored to its usual volume and enthusiasm. Nora sat in the wagon bed behind them, wrapped in her heavy coat, her brown paper package from the dry goods on her lap, watching the trail unwind beneath the wheels with a quiet alertness she brought to everything. The East Trail came out behind the livery at the far end of Silver Creek's Main Street, and they came into town from the direction no one watching the main road would expect. The street was cold and only beginning to fill with a morning's commerce. A few horses at the hitching posts, smoke from the boarding house chimney, the hardware store sweeping its porch. Margaret scanned the street from the wagon bench without moving her head. No sign of Crail. No one she recognized from the day she arrived. The First Territorial Bank's windows were dark at this hour, its door still closed. "There," Eli said quietly, and she followed his gaze to the east end of the street, where a broad, solid building with a painted sign, Calloway Laundry and Pressing, showed a light in its front window and a thin column of steam rising from the chimney. Eli helped Thomas down and took the children to the dry goods, with instructions to look at everything slowly. Margaret walked to the laundry door alone. Ruth Calloway opened it before she knocked. She was a woman of about 50, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, with hands that showed 30 years of work, and a face that showed 30 years of watching things carefully and deciding when to speak and when to hold. She looked at Margaret the way Margaret had learned to look at everyone. Direct, thorough, making a real decision rather than a reflexive one. "Mrs. Voss," she said, "come in." The laundry was warm and smelled of soap and pressed lemon. Ruth poured coffee from a pot on the back stove and set 2 cups on the work table and sat down across from Margaret without preamble. "Your father was a good man," Ruth said. "I never met him,
But I read the transcript of a property case he argued in Philadelphia in 1876. There was a family here in the valley, the Osgoods, trying to file a claim against an Eastern investment company that had defaulted on a land agreement. Your father's case established the precedent they used. She paused.
He won for people who couldn't afford to win. That matters. He did, Margaret said, until the people he was winning against found a way to stop him. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Mrs. Calloway, Eli told me what Hatch said to you, that my father had certified the investment agreements behind his operation. That's what he said. He said it to make himself sound legitimate. He said the money behind him came from established Philadelphia legal money, and I should understand what I was declining. Ruth's expression did not change, but something in it compressed slightly. The compression of a woman recalling an insult she has not forgotten. I told him I didn't care how far east his money came from. He still wasn't getting my building. Did he say the name of the firm? Calhoun and Meridian Partners? Ruth looked at her carefully. He did. Would you swear to that in an affidavit? I've been waiting 2 years for someone to give me a reason to, Ruth said. What are you building? Margaret set down the coffee cup. She opened her father's satchel and took out the accounting ledger, Daniel's 4-page statement, and the 6 pages from the false liming. She laid them on the work table between them, organized in the order she had been organizing them in her head for 3 days. I'm building a federal case, she said. Cross-state financial fraud, illegal lending practices, coercion of a minor for surveillance purposes, and conspiracy to defraud homestead property holders through manufactured debt. She looked at Ruth. I have the accounting documentation. I have a corroborating witness to the surveillance, and I have the investment documents that establish the Philadelphia connection. What I need from you is the corroborating testimony that places Hatch's own words linking Calhoun and Meridian to his Silver Creek operation. Without that, the Philadelphia connection is documentary, but not witnessed. She paused. With it, we can file in federal court, which removes Deacon Morse from the equation entirely. Ruth looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Margaret. She picked up Daniel's statement and read it. All 4 pages, carefully, not quickly, and set it back down. How old is that boy? She said. 15. Hatch used a 15-year-old child to spy on a family with 2 sick children and a new wife who'd been in the valley 3 days. It was not a question. Ruth's voice had gone flat in a specific way. The flatness of a woman whose anger has moved past heat into something colder and more durable. I have 2 letters, she said. Margaret waited. I post letters for half this valley, Ruth said. Most people don't think about what a laundry woman sees. They bring their linens, they talk, they leave things in their pockets. She stood and went to the back of the shop, to a locked tin box on the shelf above the pressing table. She opened it with a key from her apron and came back with 2 envelopes. These came through my mailbag 6 months ago. I was posting them along with the other Valley mail. I read them before I posted them. She set them on the table. I know that's not a legal thing to do. I read them anyway because one of them had the name of a family I knew on the outside, and the tone of the package made me uneasy. I read them and I copied them, and I posted the originals because I didn't know yet what to do with what I'd read. Margaret picked up the copies Ruth slid across the table. The first was a letter from Cornelius Hatch to a name she did not recognize, a man in Fargo, instructing him to file a specific county tax assessment against 4 named properties in Silver Creek Valley at the earliest opportunity, and to ensure the assessments were recorded by the county clerk before the 1st of November. One of the 4 named properties was the Voss Ranch. The second letter was the reply, confirming the assessments had been filed as instructed, The county tax assessments that had never been delivered to the property owners. The inflated assessments that would have compounded into the debt Hatch was now using as leverage. "He manufactured the tax delinquencies," Margaret said. It came out very quiet. "He manufactured all of it," Ruth said. "The debt, the delinquencies, the legal pressure. He needed the properties to look distressed before he could move on them." She looked at Margaret steadily. "The Voss Ranch is not the only one. There are 3 other families in this valley who are in the same position Eli is in. They just don't know it yet." Margaret looked at the 2 letters. She thought about her father's annotated statute book and the federal fraud provisions he had marked in the margin. A single fraudulent loan was a territorial banking violation, a coordinated campaign across multiple properties, financed by out-of-state capital, using manufactured tax delinquencies and illegal interest charges to systematically dispossess multiple homestead families. That was something considerably larger. That was something a federal judge would not be able to ignore. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "would you be willing to provide all of this, your testimony, these copies, as part of a federal court filing?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "I've been standing in this building alone for 2 years," she said, "watching Hatch work, watching people lose things they built their lives on, watching Deacon Morse look the other way." She folded her hands on the table. "I was waiting for someone who knew what to do with what I had. I didn't know it was going to be a Philadelphia lawyer's daughter who came here on a mail-order bride advertisement." The corner of her mouth moved. "But here we are." "Here we are," Margaret said. They worked at Ruth's work table for 2 hours. Margaret drafted the affidavits, Ruth's testimony, a supplementary affidavit organizing the 2 copied letters as evidence, and a comprehensive complaint document that assembled every piece of evidence into a coherent federal filing. Her hand moved steadily across the pages, her father's training running through her like a current she had always carried and was only now using at full capacity. When Eli came to collect her, Thomas on his hip and Nora at his side carrying a small bolt of blue ribbon she had chosen from the dry goods, he stopped in the doorway of the laundry and took in the table covered in organized documents and the 2 women seated across from each other with the focused alignment of people who have been working toward the same thing and have found each other in the middle of it. He looked at Margaret. "Are we ready?" he said. "We're ready," she said. She looked at Ruth. Ruth nodded. The Federal Circuit Court in Bismarck received Margaret's filing 11 days later, delivered by a courier she hired in the next town over, a man with no connection to Silver Creek or First Territorial Bank. Paid in cash from the household money Eli gave her without being asked. The filing contained the accounting ledger, Daniel Price's signed statement, Ruth Calloway's affidavit, the 2 copied letters, the 6 pages from her father's satchel establishing the Calhoun and Meridian connection, and a 40-page legal complaint citing 17 specific violations of federal banking statutes and the cross-state fraud provisions of the 1878 Territorial Commerce Act, a provision her father had annotated in red ink in the margin of his statute book, with the single word, powerful. He had been right about most things. The circuit court judge assigned to the case was a man named Harlan Cross, who had been appointed by the federal government and owed nothing to Deacon Morse or Cornelius Hatch or the county political structure that Hatch had spent a decade buying. Judge Cross issued a preliminary injunction against any foreclosure proceedings on the 4 named Silver Creek properties within 6 days of receiving the filing, which was faster than Margaret had dared to calculate. The injunction arrived in Silver Creek on a Thursday morning, delivered by a federal marshal who rode into town on a bay horse and handed the documents to Deacon Morse in his own courthouse, with the particular expressionless courtesy of a federal officer who has done this before and will do it again, and feels nothing personal about it either way. Cornelius Hatch received his copy at First Territorial Bank 20 minutes later. Margaret was not in town when it happened. She was at the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table, with the accounting ledger open in front of her, and Thomas beside her on the bench, ostensibly doing his letters, but mostly drawing horses in the margin of his practice paper, when she heard the wagon on the trail and looked up. Eli came through the door faster than his usual pace, which was the first indication. He had been in town for supplies, the ordinary cover of an ordinary supply run, and he had been there when the marshal rode in. He set his hat on the peg. He turned around. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the complicated, cautious, layered thing it usually did, but something simpler and more direct. Something that had been waiting behind all the other things for a long time. "It worked," he said. Thomas looked up from his horse drawings. "The marshal came," Eli said, to Margaret, his eyes on her face. "Cross's injunction." Morse went white as birch bark. "Hatch." He stopped. He ran a hand across his jaw. Hatch came out of the bank when the marshal left Morse's office. He stood on the street and he looked at that injunction, and then he looked up at the ridge, like he was trying to see the ranch from town. He paused. "He knows." "He's known for a while," Margaret said. "He just didn't believe it yet." "He believes it now." Eli came to the table and stood across from her, and the look on his face was past relief. Relief was too thin a word for it. It was the look of a man who has been holding something for so long that when he finally sets it down, his hands don't know what to do with themselves. "Margaret." "I know," she said. "No." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "I need to say it. I spent 2 years believing the only way this ended was with me losing the land or losing my life over it. I had worked out in my head what happened to Nora and Thomas if I was gone. I had worked it out in detail, because that is the kind of man I am. I account for the worst possibility, because if you account for it, it can't surprise you." He held her gaze. "I had not accounted for you." Thomas, who had been listening with the quiet, absolute attentiveness of a child pretending not to listen, slid off the bench and walked around the table and put his small hand flat on the table between his father's forearms. He looked up at Eli with complete seriousness. "Is the bank man going to take the house?" he said. "No," Eli said. "Because of Mrs. Voss?" Eli looked at Margaret across the table. "Yes," he said, "because of Mrs. Voss." Thomas nodded with the grave satisfaction of a child whose read on a situation has been confirmed by an adult. Then he climbed into his father's lap with the unselfconscious ease of a boy who has decided this is a safe place to be. And Eli's arm came around him automatically, the way it does when the body knows something before the mind has finished deciding it. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had heard the wagon come in, and she had heard enough. Her face was doing the careful, controlled thing, but something was cracking at the edges of it. The particular cracking that is not sadness, but its opposite. The look of a thing that has been held rigid for too long, finally being allowed to soften. "Is it done?" she said. "It's not completely done," Margaret said. "The federal court will take months to work through the full case. Hatch may fight it. My brother may find a way to complicate the Philadelphia side of things." She looked at Nora steadily. "But the injunction is in place. He cannot touch this land while the federal case is active, which means we have time, and we have the law, and we have the record." She paused. "And that means he has already lost. He just has to finish losing." Nora came into the kitchen. She stood beside the table, and she looked at the organized stacks of documents that had lived on its surface for nearly 2 weeks. She looked at her father, and at Thomas tucked against his chest, and at Margaret. Then she sat down in the chair beside Margaret, not across from her, not at a careful distance, but beside her, the way you sit next to someone you have decided is on your side. And she put both hands flat on the table and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The kitchen held them all in its warmth, the fire steady and even. The sound of the wind outside reduced to something manageable and distant. 3 months later, the Federal Circuit Court issued its ruling. Judge Cross found in full against Cornelius Hatch and First Territorial Bank on 14 of the 17 counts. The fraudulent interest charges were voided, the manufactured tax delinquencies expunged from the county record, and the bank's operating charter in Dakota Territory was suspended pending a full federal audit. Deacon Morse resigned from the county bench before the ruling was formally delivered, which everyone in Silver Creek understood to mean he had been given the choice between resigning and being named as a co-respondent in the federal filing. Gerald Calhoun of Calhoun and Meridian Partners in Philadelphia entered into a negotiated settlement with the federal court that required, among other things, the disgorgement of all profits derived from the Silver Creek land acquisition scheme. Preston Caldwell, who had been a named associate in the investment agreements, was disbarred by the Pennsylvania Bar Association and quietly left Philadelphia before the winter. Margaret did not celebrate this. She noted it, filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were finished, and turned her attention to what was in front of her. The 3 other families whose properties had been named in Margaret's original filing received federal notifications that their fraudulent tax delinquencies had been voided. None of them had known, until that notification arrived, that anyone had been fighting on their behalf. 2 of them came to the Voss Ranch in person to say so, and Margaret received them at the kitchen table with coffee, and said only that it had been the right thing to do, and that they owed her nothing. Ruth Calloway's testimony was specifically cited in Judge Cross's ruling as material to establishing the interstate conspiracy. Ruth framed the citation and hung it above the pressing table in her laundry, and when customers asked about it, she told them, without embellishment, what had happened, because she believed the people of Silver Creek Valley deserved to know exactly how close they had come to losing everything, and exactly what had stopped it. Daniel Price was not charged with anything. He went back to working at the feed store, whose owner, Hatch's brother-in-law, had quietly distanced himself from his relative the moment the federal marshal rode into town. Daniel came to the ranch the following spring to help with the fence line repairs, unasked, and worked 2 full days without accepting payment. And Margaret understood this was his way of finishing what he had started. The West Pasture Mineral Survey that Hatch had commissioned, the one that had started everything, the reason Eastern money had flowed into Silver Creek in the first place, was ultimately found to be accurate. There was silver under the Voss land. Not a fortune, but enough. Eli used the first 2 seasons of modest extraction revenue to repair the barn roof, rebuild the corrals, and put aside enough against a hard winter that they did not have to calculate for the first time in 3 years what the family could afford to lose. He told Margaret about it the evening the first extraction payment came in, sitting at the kitchen table that now had 4 chairs around it, the lamp turned up, Thomas already asleep, and Nora doing her reading at the far end of the table with the focused self-possession of a girl who had stopped carrying what wasn't hers to carry and had found, in the putting down of it, that she had considerably more energy for the things that were. Eli put the bank draft on the table between them and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "My father always said the land would provide," he said. "I stopped believing that." "You stopped believing a lot of things," Margaret said. "Yes." He looked at her. "I've started believing some of them again." She held his gaze. The fire was steady and even behind her, the draw clean and balanced on both sides, the way it had been since the night she arrived and fixed the coupling pin with the spine of a kitchen knife, because it was a thing that needed doing, and she was the one who was there. She thought about Philadelphia and about the boarding house reading room where she had found the advertisement at the bottom of a stack of newspapers, and about the 14 months of fighting and losing, and the road running out beneath her feet. She thought about her father pressing her fingers to the brass tack along the interior seam of the satchel and saying, "Not until you're somewhere safe," as if he had known, or hoped, which in her father's case had often been the same thing, that somewhere safe existed and that she would find her way to it.
She had not found her way to it. She had built it. Out of documents and statute books and cold, clear mornings and the particular, durable trust of 2 children who had decided she was worth trusting, and a man who had stopped rationing what he felt because she had demonstrated consistently and without drama that she could hold what he gave her without dropping it. "I'm glad I came," she said. The same words she had said 3 months ago. She meant them more now, which she had not thought possible. "So am I," Eli said. The same words. And then, because he was the kind of man who said things once and let them stand, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his calloused, certain fingers settling around hers with the ease of something that has found its right place, and he left his hand there and looked at her with the full, unguarded directness of a man who has finished being afraid of what he might show if he stopped being careful. Outside, the Dakota winter was beginning its long, slow retreat. The ice on the creek was softening at the edges. The pines on the ridge held their snow another week, and then let it go. Inside the Voss Ranch, on the south face of the ridge, the fire held its ground, and the table had 4 chairs, and Margaret Voss had built something that no forged document, and no corrupt banker, and no frightened brother 3,000 miles away could touch. Not because it was written in any statute book, though it was, but because it had been built out of the hardest materials available. Honesty, work, and the decision, made daily and without fanfare, to stay. Some things, once built that way, do not come down.